Senate will come to order. Mr. Carpenter, please call the roll.
Senators Aguilar, Baumgardner, Cook, Coram, Court, Crowder, Donovan, Finberg, Fields, Garcia, Gardner, Guzman, Hill, Holbert, John, Jones,
Excused.
Kagan, Kafalis, Kerr, Lambert, Lumberg, Marble, Martinez-Humenick, Merrifield, Moreno, Neville, Priola, Scott, Smallwood, Sonnenberg, Tate, Todd, Williams, Zinzinger, Mr. President.
Here. 34 present, 0 absent, 1 excused. We have a quorum. Senator Court. Senator Court, please come and lead us in the pledge.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, guests, please join me. I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Approval of the journal, Senator Zenzinger.
I move that the reading of the Journal of April 5th be dispensed with and the Journal be approved as corrected by the Secretary and play ball.
You've heard the motion. Is there any objection? Seeing none, the motion is adopted. Senate Services.
Correctly printed, Senate Bill 231. Correctly engrossed, Senate Bill 86, 158, and 201. Correctly re-engrossed, Senate Bill 208 and 213. Correctly revised, House Bill 1132, 1237, and 1259. Correctly re-revised, House Bill 1065, 1093, 1104, 1109, 1211, 1243, 1282, 1322, 1323, 1324, 1325, 1326, 1327, 1328, 1329, 1330, 1331, 1332, 1333, 1334, 1336, 1337, 1338, 1339, and 1340.
Third reading of bills, final passage. Mr. Carpenter, would you please read the title to House Bill 1237?
House Bill 1237 by Representatives Kraft, Tharp, and Van Winkle, and Senator Neville, concerning the continuation of the requirements regarding the preparation of cost-benefit analysis as administered by the Department of Regulatory Agencies in connection with implementing the recommendations contained in the 2017 Sunset Report by the Department of Regulatory Agencies and making an appropriation.
Senator Neville.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I move House Bill 1237 on third and final reading and ask for an aye vote. Colleagues, we have a good cost-benefit analysis system, and we've actually found a way to improve it at a minor cost, which can be well worth it. One of the challenges that we have with regulation is trying to identify what that cost is on businesses. And making sure that we are not putting something that a regulation process that could become less burdensome. And one of the challenges we always have here is that we try to do it after the fact. We try to identify kind of what went wrong and try to patchwork it. The amendment that we put on this bill allows something that we do at the federal level. We've been doing it for a number of years, where we identify a cost to businesses. The federal side uses $100 million as a threshold, so that's $100 million in a year. So when we take a look at it here in Colorado, we would look at it at $10 million over 5 years. That's a pretty high threshold, but if we see something there, and we are seeing some challenges right now. I just met with some folks that are involved in assisted living, and they're seeing some challenges there with new regulations that are going to be extremely costly. In those cases, as opposed to trying to make a mistake and try to rectify it later, this simply allows a cost-benefit analysis that would be done by the state of Colorado. In that case, DORA brings it over to OSPB in the governor's office, and they would do a cost-benefit analysis and bring it back. And the big advantage of this is it's a user-friendly process. It allows businesses to make their comments as they always have under cost benefits. That continues. And the issue of making sure that businesses have an ability to see what's coming at them from the websites on cost benefit analysis on new regulations that are being promulgated by the departments. But this is one extra piece that allows OSPB then to come back with possible ideas that could be even better, or could be either less expensive to business, or just simply doing the cost-benefit analysis. And if it is needed and it provides necessary consumer protections, then at least we understand what that cost is going to be. So urgent aye vote.
Is there any further discussion on House Bill 1237? Seeing none, the motion for the body is the adoption of House Bill 1237. Are there any no votes? Senator Kerr, Senator Zenzinger, Senator Donovan, Senator Court, these are no votes on 1237. Senator Merrifield, Senator Kerr, Senator Garcia, Senator Guzman, Senator Fields, Senator Kagan, Senator Aguilar, With 24 ayes, 10 noes, 0 absent, 1 excused, House Bill 1237 is adopted. Co-sponsors: Majority Leader Holbert, Senator Marble, Senator Crowder, Senator Scott, Senator Gardner, Senator Sonnenberg, Senator Baumgardner, Senator Smallwood, Senator Lambert, Senator Martinez-Humenick, Senator Lundberg, Senator Tate, Senator Hill, Senator Cook, Senator John, Senator Williams. Please add the President. Mr. Carpenter, would you please read the title of Senate Bill 86?
Senate Bill 86 by Senators Lambert and Williams and Representatives Janal and Rankin concerning the use of cybercode and cryptology for state records in connection therewith making an appropriation.
Senator Williams.
Thank you, Mr. President. We move Senate Bill 1886 on third reading and final passage and ask for an aye vote.
Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, the motion before the body is the adoption of Senate Bill 86. Are there any no votes? Senator Smallwood. With 33 ayes, 1 no, 0 absent, 1 excused, Senate Bill 86 is adopted. Co-sponsors: Senator Todd, Senator Donovan, Senator John, Senator Martinez-Humenick, Senator Tate, Senator Merrifield, Senator Lundberg, Senator Hill, Senator Fenberg, Senator Neville, Senator Gardner, Senator Kerr. Please add the President. Mr. Carpenter, please read the title of Senate Bill 158.
Senate Bill 158 by Senators Corman, Garcia, and Representatives Duran and Catlin concerning measures to increase school district access to interoperable communication technology to improve school safety and in connection therewith making an appropriation.
Senator Corum.
Thank you, Mr. President. We move Senate Bill 18158 on third reading and final passage.
Is there any further discussion? The motion before the body is the adoption of Senate Bill 158. Are there any no votes? Senator Smallwood. With 33 ayes, 1 no, 0 absent, 1 excused, Senate Bill 158 is adopted. Co-sponsors: Senator Kafalis, Senator Kagan, Senator Court, Senator Donovan, Senator Neville, Senator Scott, Senator Gardner, Senator Martinez-Humenick, Senator Tate, Senator Crowder, Senator Lambert, Senator Gardner, Senator Cook, Senator John, Senator Fenberg, Senator Merrifield, Senator Todd, Senator Williams, Senator Aguilar, Senator Fields, Senator Zenzinger, Senator Kerr, Senator Marble, Senator Lundberg. Please add the President. Mr. Carpenter, would you please read the title of the House Bill 1132?
House Bill 1132 by Representative Michelson, Judea, and Senator Crowder concerning the amount that the Department of Corrections is required to reimburse a county or city and county for the confinement and maintenance in a local jail of any person who is sentenced to a term of imprisonment or correctional facility.
Senator Crowder.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move House Bill 1132 and ask for an aye vote.
Is there any further discussion? The motion before the body is the adoption of House Bill 1132. Are there any no votes? With 34 ayes, 0 noes, 0 absent, 1 excused, House Bill 1132 is adopted. Co-sponsors: Senator Corum, Senator Merrifield, Senator Martinez-Humenick, Senator Tate, Senator Lambert, Senator Cook, Senator Court, Senator Kafalis, Senator Moreno, Senator Fields, Senator Todd, Senator Gardner, Senator Lundberg, Senator Kerr. Please add the President. Mr. Carpenter, please read the title of Senate Bill 201.
Senate Bill 201 by Senator Priola concerning the application of child care licensing requirements for religious organizations for the time period during which services or programs are being offered.
Senator Holbert.
Thank you, Mr. President. For lack of a House sponsor and at the request of the sponsor, I move to lay over Senate Bill 201 till Thursday, April 12th.
Motion is to lay over Senate Bill 201 till Thursday, April 12th. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes have it, and that will lay over. Mr. Carpenter, please read the title of House Bill 1259.
House Bill 1259 by Representative Gray and Senator Marble concerning providing marijuana samples to employees for business purposes.
Senator Marble.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move House Bill 1259 on third reading and final passage and ask for an aye vote.
Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, the motion for the body is the adoption of House Bill 1259. Are there any no votes? Senator Cook, Senator Martinez-Humenick, Senator Gardner, Senator Priola. 1259, no votes on 1259. Senator Scott, Senator Priola, Senator Lambert. With 28 ayes, 6 noes, 0 absent, 1 excused, House Bill 1259 is adopted. Co-sponsors: Senator Smallwood, Senator Neville, Senator Merrifield, Senator Tate, General Order, second reading of bills. Senator Sonnenberg.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move the Senate now resolve itself into the Committee of the Whole for the purpose of General Order, second reading of bills.
Motion for the body is for the Senate to resolve itself in the Committee of the Whole for consideration of the General Order's second reading of bills calendar. All those in favor say aye. All opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the Senate will resolve itself in the Committee of the Whole for consideration of the General Order's second reading of bills calendar. Senator Sonnenberg will take the chair.
The committee will come to order. The court rule will be relaxed for anybody that is sporting Colorado Rockies. Actually, it'll be relaxed for everybody. Mr. Carpenter, please read the title to Senate Bill 43.
Senate Bill 43 by Senator Grantham and Representative Lundeen concerning the legal effects of the rejection by the Senate of an individual nominated by the governor for appointment to a state office have on the subsequent nomination or temporary appointment of the same individual to or holdover of the individual in the same state office.
Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Here we go. Mr. Chair, I move Senate Bill 43.
We have an amendment on the desk.
I'd like to talk a little bit first. Thank you, sir.
Mr. President, please continue.
Colleagues, Senate Bill 43, I know there's been much anticipation, at least over on one side. Senate Bill 43 is intended to preserve Colorado's constitutional separation of powers by ensuring that a governor cannot rely on ad interim appointments and laws that allow an incumbent office holder to remain in office after his or her term expires until his or her successor is duly qualified to thwart the Senate's power to prevent any individual whose nomination for appointment to public office is subject to Senate confirmation from holding or temporarily discharging the duties of the office if the Senate deems the individual unfit to do so. Some of the aspects of the legislation we can go into detail on. I'll give a brief explanation on each of these. The effect of the legislation would be that Senate rejection equals ineligibility. That is the understanding and the intent that we have seen in the history of this state and a history across our country. So the bill specifies that if the governor nominates an individual for an appointment to a state office and the Senate rejects that nomination, the rejected individual is deemed legally unfit for and ineligible to hold that office. And part and parcel with that with this bill is no renomination for that same office. The governor is prohibited from nominating the rejected individual a second time for that same office. or if the Senate is not in session, appointing that rejected individual to temporarily discharge the duties of the office. There is an exception where a renomination after an intervening individual holds that office. The rejection by the Senate of a nomination of that individual for any state office would not preclude the governor from nominating the rejected individual for an opening in that same office that occurs after another individual in an intervening period fills that opening. One point was brought up in committee, and I'll be offering Amendment 14 here shortly to address that issue. But if a rejected individual, if a person is rejected by a Senate in a particular General Assembly, that rejection does not carry over into the next General Assembly. That a General Assembly should not be held to the decisions of the prior General Assembly. And that individual can be renominated for that position by the next General Assembly, by the next Senate of the next General Assembly. The bill also provides that if the governor nominates a state officer whose term is expiring for reappointment to the same office and the Senate rejects the nomination, the state officer is removed from office upon the expiration of his or her term and shall not thereafter exercise the duties of the office whether or not the individual successor has been duly qualified. Also, if, as of the effective date of the bill, the term of office of a state officer has expired, the Senate has rejected a nomination for reappointment of the state officer to the same office, and the individual is continuing to exercise the duties of the office because the individual successor has not yet been qualified, the state officer is deemed to have been removed from office on the date that his or her term expired and shall immediately stop exercising the duties of the office. Those are the essentials of the bill. And, Mr. Chair, as I noted, I will offer Amendment 14 at this time.
There is an amendment on the desk. Mr. Carpenter, please read Amendment L014.
Amendment L014.
Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I noted before, Amendment 14 is
Would you please move?
plugging that hole for a renomination where a new General Assembly, in this case, if a rejection were to take place here in the next 5 weeks, that the General Assembly, the Senate of the next General Assembly, next January, the governor could renominate an individual that was rejected this year and for that same position, and the Senate would not be beholden to rejecting that, or the governor's not beholden to that once a new General Assembly is in office, and I would ask for an aye vote.
Mr. President, I need you to move the amendment.
I move Amendment L014.
Is there any other discussion on Amendment L014? Seeing none, all those in... Senator Fields.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, Mr. President, I just have one question. Was the governor's office and his staff a part of crafting this amendment at all?
Not in crafting this.
Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not in crafting this amendment, Senator, nor in this bill.
See no further discussion. The question before us is the adoption of Amendment L014. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. L014 is adopted. Is there any other discussion? Senator Kagan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move L001.
I do not have an amendment on the desk anywhere. Mr. Carpenter, there is indeed an amendment on the desk. Mr. Carpenter, would you please read Amendment L001?
Amendment L001, Senate Bill 43.
Senator Kagan.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, the members...
Mr. Chair, and you still need to move the amendment now that it's been read.
I move Amendment L001.
Thank you. Now proceed. Senator Kagan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman of the Committee of the Whole. Mr. Chair, members, the power to nominate and appoint is a mixed power between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Neither has complete control over the appointment process. It is to the executive branch to nominate and to the legislative branch to either approve or reject the nomination. There is no separation of powers. There are jointly exercised powers here in that respect. And what Amendment 1 does is it makes an exception to the rule in Senate Bill 43, which would otherwise simply say, once rejected by the Senate, then cannot be renominated. And Amendment 1 adds a very important caveat to that, which in the future may be crucially important and is part of our great tradition in Colorado of making sure that we are not making decisions either in the legislative branch or in the executive branch. We are not making decisions improperly based on race, gender, religious conviction, but we are making all our decisions on proper grounds. We do this in all areas of activity, and we do it rightly so, because we must be ever vigilant to make sure that these improper considerations of race, gender, sexual orientation, and other protected classes do not allow, and that we do not allow those classes to find their way into our decision-making process in an improper way. So what Amendment L001 does is it says, all right, once rejected, always rejected with the amendment for this General Assembly, may not be renominated unless an assertion is made by the governor that the reason may have been based for the initial rejection may have been based on sex, race, color, national identity, religion, sexual orientation, gender or gender identity, or disability. Because it is very proper that we have some kind of ability for the governor to say, well, although in general I would not resubmit a nomination that the Senate has seen fit to reject, in those cases where I believe, I as the governor believe, that this was an improper consideration, I'd like you to take another look at this individual with that in mind. And what I ask of you members, is it not proper that if the allegation is made or the claim is made that we may have improperly applied criteria to our rejection of a nomination, that we at least be permitted to take a second look at it. A second look if it is asserted that this was done on the basis of race, sex, gender, national origin, religious belief, or the existence of a disability. We should take a second look. We shouldn't be afraid of taking a second look. We shouldn't be nervous of taking a second look where that is the claim. We should welcome a second look. I urge you members to enthusiastically vote for Senate Bill 1 so that we will know that future Senates, when this has been suggested, are willing and able to take a second look to just double check, was this done properly? And have the governor have the ability to say, not just please, but I require you to take a second look, not to control the decision, not to say, no, we must change our decision, but simply to say, this warrants a second look to see if there were improper considerations brought to bear when we made our initial rejection. That is something we owe it to our minority populations, whether it be minority because they have a disability, or of a minority sexual orientation, or of a minority religious persuasion, or any other minority status, which makes them at least vulnerable to that being improperly considered. We should enthusiastically want to take a second look, and we should welcome that, and therefore we should enthusiastically, I submit to you, members, support Amendment L001.
Senator Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, the senator from Cherry Hills Village, I guess, is, I understand the well-motivated basis for this, but first of all, it doesn't work in practice for any rejection of a nomination. It doesn't work in practice because any future governor, all the current governor or any future governor has to say, once a nomination is rejected, all they have to say is, as part of the nomination statement that the governor of the new nomination, that the governor believes the Senate may have rejected the prior nomination of the individual for appointment to the office on the basis of the individual's sex, race, color, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I don't know what crawls around in and I don't want to be disparaging, but let me just say it that way. I don't know what crawls around in the minds of the 34 others of you there's an assumption here, I suppose, on the part of the senator from Cherry Hills Village that it's ugly, and that you vote on the basis of your discriminatory practices and not on the basis of one's qualification for an office. And all the governor on the first floor has to say is, well, it may have been because of that. It may have been. Well, I've heard enough discussion over the past 80-plus days here about what people's motivations might be that I think anyone, anywhere, any place, anytime can conclude that you, or you, or you, or you, or you, anyone in this chamber may have acted because someone was, well, I don't know, too old, too young. That's all it takes. But with so many things written as the way the senator has from Cherry Hills Village, it's got a fatal infirmity. Senator, your amendment has a real serious infirmity. And it is this. You know, the Civil Rights Commission statute, as it's currently written, requires, absolutely requires, that a certain number of members of the commission be members of a protected class. By definition, that they be of a protected sex, race, color, national origin, religion, age, sexual orientation, gender, gender identity, or disability. Absolutely requires it. So what if a future governor appoints someone to one of those positions and I'm of a protected class? No, that will come as a shock to you, but under the Age and Discrimination in Employment Act, I'm of a protected class. I'm over 40. I know that comes as a shock to all of you as well, that I'm over 40. And I could be appointed for one of those positions, and a future governor might do so. Not me personally, but might do so. And, you know, this Senate might decide that that didn't really fill the bill, or that that person didn't really meet the requirements, or that they really weren't so, or a myriad of other reasons that are up to you as elected members of this body. So then what? This body rejects that nomination and says, it's supposed to be someone of a protected class. And I don't think the 41-year-old white male, even though the statute says that that's a member of a protected class, I don't think that's quite what we had in mind when we put the Civil Rights Commission statute together. And so you reject that. The governor would rightly be able to reject that, Senator, because the governor would have reason to believe that the Senate may have rejected the prior nomination of the individual for appointment to the office on the basis of the individual's age. This, first of all, is a blank check to any governor and essentially guts the bill. That's a term of art. And at the same time, it would allow for a manipulation that I think many of us in this chamber would think was absolutely inappropriate by the governor appointing an unqualified person, statutorily unqualified, us rejecting them, and that person, and the governor sitting on the first floor says, well, so what? I think that person was rejected because of their age, their race, their national origin. This is a really wrong-headed amendment. It is an amendment, perhaps it makes some political point when you put it here, but it doesn't work, and it assumes the worst of this body and each of us, and it usurps the authority of this body to confirm and to properly confirm or reject appointments made by the governor. I asked for a no vote on L01 because it is simply a disastrous idea, ill-conceived, ill-thought out, in practice would be the most. It would exacerbate the situation that the senator from Cherry Hills Village wants to resolve. I could think of 2 or 3 or 5 ways as I stand here this morning, having just seen it 5 minutes ago. I can think of multiple ways to game it in a way that the senator would have never intended.
Senator Quorum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to ask for a no on this amendment, and I'm one of the people that went through a situation similar like this. Last year, it was a nominee came before the committee, Ag Committee, if I recall, and that nominee was rejected. That nominee was rejected because it didn't meet the qualifications of the appointment. That's the one and only reason. This person was, again, recently nominated to another position that met those qualifications. That nomination came out of a committee on the consent calendar and was approved unanimously by this body. I don't know the intent, and I will not speculate of why we're running this amendment, but to me, this amendment takes the Senate totally out of the process of appointees. A governor could say, I think that person would resign because like me. He's too fat. I don't want fat people on my committee. He's too old. I'm too old. For any reason, the governor could pick that that person was discriminated against. And frankly, members, I do not believe that this committee, this body, is made up of a bunch of cold-hearted individuals that have hate in their heart for certain people. I think we look at everybody as equals, and I think it should be done because the person is qualified. I will never ask to take the ability of the way the governor to appoint, but the governor also has to take some responsibility, has to have some skin in the game, that he nominates someone who meets the qualifications of the appointment. Ask for no vote.
Senator Kagan.
Thank you. I just want to make 2 points quickly. Firstly, this does not allow the governor to continually, time and again, keep sending back the same rejected individual on the basis that they may have been discriminated against on the basis of some protected class membership. What this amendment says is the governor may nominate the rejected individual a second time. That's it, a second time. And in the other section it says the individual may continue to exercise the duties of the office until the individual's successor has been duly qualified. These are temporary, or in the first instance, just a second look. And the purpose of the second look is not to find out whether the Senate exercised some terrible, vicious, ugly, discriminatory prejudice when they did the first rejection. It is just so that the Senate may check their implicit biases, which we all occasionally exercise unless we think really carefully. As we have heard over and over again, we don't, when we, and we all do it, make assumptions about people. Sometimes we're not even aware we're doing it. It's not done with any malice. It's just the exercise of an intuitive implicit bias that tends to creep in unless we guard against it and check against it. This enables the Senate, with the help of the governor, to check to make sure that a rejection was not the result of a non-malicious, unintended exercise of implicit bias that somehow made its way into the decision-making process. And it only allows the governor to nominate a second time for that check. That is in the highest traditions of our decision-making process in this great state, that before we finally say yes or no, we give ourselves a check. Am I making that decision without engaging any of the implicit biases to which we are all subject unless we check carefully to make sure they are banished from our thinking process? This asks for a simple, fair, measured, one time only, just self-check before we finally do the rejection, if the governor thinks this is an appropriate case for a second look. Thank you, members.
Senator Lundberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to come down and engage on the debate, and I appreciate both the bill and the amendment. I appreciate the amendment that's before us, which I'm hardly asking us to reject, but I believe the amendment helps point out why this legislation is appropriate, and I want to remind the body, if possible, Mr. Chair, that
our system of government is set up with necessary checks and balances. And of course, it's the basic three branches of government, the legislative, the judicial, and the executive. And there's a tension that's intentionally structured within our constitutional framework that balances those powers. And in the case of the appointments by the governor, the Senate has the prerogative to approve or disapprove of those appointments. That is a power vested in the Senate by our Constitution. Now, the reason I appreciate the amendment before us is it allows us to look and ask this fundamental question. Should then, therefore, the Senate intentionally erode our authority, which this amendment most directly does, because it allows the executive branch to have, you might say, a second bite at the apple. The process is very straightforward, and it's worked very well over the decades, and indeed we're well into the second century of the state of Colorado, because the governor makes appointments, but the Senate has the authority for those appointments that require senatorial review to balance the governor's authority there and say, no, in our judgment, this is not appropriate. And remarkably, when the Senate did exercise that authority last year, as I recall in the press, I believe the governor was quoted as saying he considered it bothersome that the Senate rejected an appointment. And then he proceeded to ignore it in a very practical way by continuing on with that appointment for some months. That's why I appreciate this bill as being appropriate, because the Senate is drawing a very clear line in the sand and saying, no, our constitutional authority will not be overridden by a governor who wants to ignore that authority. Now, again, I ask that this amendment be rejected because the amendment comes back and says, well, let's give the executive branch a little bit more power here. That's not appropriate. The balance is tenuous at best, as was proven by the governor's inaction of following through with the Senate's authority to reject an appointment. And so that yields the appropriateness of Senate Bill 43, which says no, and we mean it. And not only would it be a constitutional requirement, which really should be without question, but this specifies in statute exactly how that process is to be followed through. This is a most appropriate discussion, and the discussion is the balance of power between the three branches of government, in this case, the executive and the legislative. It is important that we assert ourselves from time to time. In the years I've been down here, I've seen, footnotes on long bills. Do they have authority or not, for example? And this is one of those cases where the Senate needs to clearly state, we mean it. We mean to follow our constitutional duty and authority, and we mean for the executive branch to understand that clearly and to follow through as well. Please reject this amendment, accept this bill. It's the right thing to do.
Senator Fields.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair. Members, I rise in opposition of Senate Bill 001. I support Senate Bill 1, and I oppose the bill. So I'm speaking on behalf of this amendment because I want to make sure that the message that you're hearing from my colleagues is that we think that there's issues as it relates to you all being racist or being evil or some of the tone and the language that I heard down here. It's not about that. This is about allowing us to have a second look. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with being thoughtful? What's wrong with being careful? What's wrong with being deliberate? By giving us the opportunity to have a second look. I think that's the right thing to do. Sometimes mistakes happen. And what happens far too often is sometimes we hear of some of these nominees or what have you have experience in various different districts, and maybe that comes into play when the nomination comes up, and we hear later about certain things that may have been unfair that might require us to take a second look. That second look may be required because the information was inaccurate in reference to that experience that was portrayed, that influenced that ultimate decision, and we need to rethink it. Doesn't take much time, but I believe a second chance and a second look is a good thing to do. It shows how thoughtful we are. So I would urge support of this amendment.
Senator Kerr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Chair, I will be running all of my comments through you, the chair, as is not only the tradition here in the Senate, but also the rules of debate is that we address the chair and not each other, or stand here at the podium and stare at each other along those lines. So, Mr. Chair, thank you very much. And a couple of comments that I want to make about this amendment and some of the comments that have been made about this. First of all, I find it interesting that we've been told that the process is very straightforward and has worked well for over 100 years, which makes me wonder why we need the bill in the first place. But I really see this amendment highlighting the fact that here in the Senate, through the confirmation process for cabinet members, for appointees, we're basically the human resource hurdle for confirmations. And all other employees of the state are protected on the basis of that individual's sex, race, color, national origin, religion, age, sexual orientation, gender, or gender identity, or disability. Everyone hired by the state of Colorado has those protections currently and enforced through our various HR departments in various places. So to get hired as a snowplow driver, to get hired as a nurse working for the state, our state troopers, computer specialists, legislative staff, our custodians. All of these folks, when they go through the hiring process and get hired by the state of Colorado, are protected in the hiring process on the basis of their sex, race, color, national origin, religion, age, sexual orientation, gender or gender identity, or disability. But through the confirmation process, the folks who tend to run these departments or be somewhere in a position of power in these departments, those folks are not, unless we pass this amendment. Because it was mentioned up here, Mr. Chair, that perhaps we don't all, I believe the term was what's crawling through the minds of the 34 of you. And Mr. Chair, I direct that to you, even though the comment was made directly to sitting senators. But it was made in a way that made me think that that there was doubt in the motivation and doubt in the intellectual ability of many of the senators in here. But also, Mr. Chair, the comments were made that senators in this chamber do not think that they serve with 34 others who have hate in their heart. And so on the one hand, it was questioned what's crawling through the minds of the rest of us, and the other hand, it was said that we don't have hate in our hearts. So I don't know where each one of us falls out on that spectrum, but like most things in life, I believe the truth is probably somewhere in between. None of us is perfect. I don't think any of us are perfect. And so the truth being somewhere in between there, I think that this is basically due process. This amendment brings due process. It's that second look, the second time that perhaps there was a question brought up around that individual's sex, race, color, national origin, religion, age, sexual orientation, gender, or gender identity or disability. And if that's the case, that we can act as the human resource office to make sure that the folks going through the confirmation process are afforded those protections and that due process as well. I ask for your aye vote on L001. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, members, since my comments and remarks of a few moments ago were construed, I believe misconstrued, let me be clear. My point was this amendment carries the implications that I stated. I believe the best of each and every one of you. I believe you act out of the highest. We all have our moments here, but I do believe that you act out of the highest and the best and what in each of you in your own conscience, and each of you do have a conscience, are the best of reasons and motivations in your own mind. And you may be mistaken, and I think many of you might think I'm mistaken from time to time. I don't know how that could be, but the point is the amendment is flawed. The point is that the amendment gives the executive a blank check. And I have to say, members, I understand that that the senator from Lakewood is not an attorney. So when he uses terms like due process, he may not be using them in their legal sense, but, you know, members, due process is a courthouse term. We have a legislative process here, and legislatures act by a different set of legal standards. That doesn't mean that we don't have an obligation, each of us, to provide fundamental fairness in our actions. But due process happens across the street. We have a legislative process, and even across the street, I think their precedent would stand very clearly for the prospect that this chamber confirms or rejects nominations, and the reasons and the basis and the underlying motivations for doing so are not questioned by the courts. And they can be politically questioned by the executive branch, all they wish as we question the executive branch probably every other sentence here. But to, on the one hand, have a bill that tries to restore balance in the nomination process and to make it realistic and to not have it disregarded on the first floor, and then to add an amendment that says, well, in the first floor they can come up with any rubric they want to because that's what it allows. And in fact, that rubric it may have been motivated by one of these list of protected class categories, may have been, really allows the executive branch to legally reject our motivations. And I venture to say that on any vote that we take on anything, my motivation is somewhat different from yours, even if we vote the same way. So I just would note to the senator from Lakewood, my comments earlier are about how, while it might not have been intended that way, this amendment L01, it has an underlying assumption of ugliness on the part of this body, that this body would act that way. Not only that one of us might, but that a majority of this body would act that way. And to me, that is so offensive. It is the reason for my earlier remarks and the stridency of them. It is so offensive to me to imply that a majority of this body, anyone, but in this case it would be a majority of this body, had acted on the basis of discrimination in rejecting a nomination. If I were to vote yes on the amendment, I would be indicting all of you and your ability to act on the basis of proper motivations. It is an indictment, that amendment. It may not have been intended that way, but it is an indictment. Reject it, members, reject it.
Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll ask for a no vote on Amendment 1. One of the comments that was originally made by the amendment sponsor noted that this is not about separation of powers, but it was implied that this is more about the I guess these are my words, the partnership of this nomination process and the role of the governor and the role of the Senate. And there is some element of truth to that, in that there are two roles being played here. But conflating that and saying that there is not an actual separation of powers here and not a separation of powers issue is false. The governor has a role in putting forward nominees, and the Senate has its very distinct role in examining them and accepting them or rejecting them. This amendment will further dilute that distinct relationship, giving the governor, as it was mentioned here, that additional bite at the apple, giving the governor the ability to say, try again, giving the governor the ability to effectively be the 36th member of this chamber with veto power over our decisions. That is what this amendment does. It was characterized as a blank check. I believe that's true. That's what this amendment will effectively accomplish, giving the governor the ability, any governor, future governors the ability to tell us, you know, nice try, here's a pat on the head, now try again. This is more than a second look, folks. That was one other characterization. This is more than a second look. Let's look at the actual process. We've been through it 100 times just this year. And in our careers here in the Senate, we've been through it multiple times every year. And when nominees, when potential applicants come to the governor and they apply for certain positions, they go through those processes. They go through the vetting with the governor's office before he even nominates, before he sends them up to be heard, to be confirmed. And then it goes through committees, and it goes through our committee process for hearings. And then it comes to the Senate. This is more than a second look. This is a rejection of the entire process on its face. This is saying, regardless of all that, the governor can come back and say, well, because of what I believe, then therefore, you guys need to try again. How many bites at the apple are we going to give and give the governor an additional veto on our clear, constitutionally granted power? Is the governor to be the conscience of the Senate? Is the governor to be the conscience of the Senate? That is what this amendment does. This is not about protected classes, but this is certainly about granting the governor a seat at the table right here in the Senate. And I would ask for a no vote. I would have one additional question for whomever. Was the governor or the governor's office or the governor's staff consulted in the drafting of this amendment? Because I'm not kidding. There is one beneficiary of this amendment. One. And that is the governor of the state of Colorado. And we are granting him the ability to be our conscience. So I'm wondering, was he consulted? Was his staff consulted in the drafting of this amendment? I'd ask for a no vote.
Senator Kerr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to reply to the question asked, and the answer is no.
Seeing no further discussion, question for us is the adoption of Amendment L001. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. The noes have it. The amendment has failed. There is another amendment on the desk. Mr. Carpenter, please read Amendment L007.
Amendment L007 to Senate Bill 43 by Senator Kagan.
Senator Court.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move 007.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, members, we just rejected a pretty sweeping suggestion on how to approach this, so let's break it down to pieces. This amendment says that we cannot reject the person based on age. Now, we have precedent for this being an issue. It's in the public record. I was in committee when we had testimony from the state treasurer, who was a candidate for governor, who was discussing a nomination process for a board in this that we have here in Colorado, and about individuals who would be nominated to that board. And our treasurer was talking about why we needed to change the makeup of the board we were discussing. And he said, quote, "We don't need a bunch of gray hairs." This is public record. Now, that was a blatant, obvious comment about a prejudice against people of age, older people. I took offense, and I pointed that out during the hearing. But the discussion we just had about the previous amendment shows that we can have implicit bias. We've discussed it on other bills as well. And so the whole notion of implicit bias or publicly stated bias is a valid concern. and we should be attentive to it, and we should want to be positive that that does not enter our judgments when we are considering people, volunteers from the community, to serve on various boards. And when the public record shows an elected official blatantly expressing a concern about a bunch of gray hairs, I think we need to be aware that these biases exist and that we should fight against them. I was offended by that comment, as the public record shows, and others were as well. And I suggest that there are plenty of members of this body who could also be offended by an implication that people with gray hair are somehow lesser and we don't need them to serve on various boards or commissions. So I believe that making certain that none of the nominations that ever go through here have experienced any aspect of rejection because of age is an important thing for us to add to this bill. So I urge an aye on 007.
Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the same reasons already stated, I'd ask for a no vote. This simply is just another attempt, cloaked in whatever else it may be, to give the governor an extra shot at this and to give the governor a seat at the table here in the Senate.
Senator Guzman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, I have been reading recently the book Lyndon Johnson, the book about his years in the United States Senate. And I'm learning a lot there. One of the things I have learned is that one of our members on this side of the aisle is correct. It is the Senate that is given the responsibility, the constitutional responsibility, to confirm or not confirm. However, our question is not whether or not the Senate has the right. For me, as I've read that book, what I'm questioning is who questions the Senate? Are we not to question the Senate once their responsibility has been done? Let me give you an example of what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years that I've been here. It came up in the Education Committee, the Senate Education Committee, a few years ago, maybe last year or certainly the year before. There were members from a major university that were to be nominated and renominated. They were rejected, or they were given different kind of treatment solely on the decision that university was part of major scientific research, stem cell research. Those folks were given a horrible time, and that university was not able to stand up to what it really needed. I think that's what we're questioning here, not that the Senate doesn't have the responsibility, but we're questioning or asking, let's make our constitutional right, let's make that good. Let's make it polished. Let's make it substantial. We have to find a way to make sure that when we make our decisions as Senate committee members upon a confirmation, that those are done fairly, without prejudice, but they are done fairly. I take issue that they have not always been done fairly. I'm not talking about this latest incidents, but I'm just saying, how do we, I agree, the Senate, this is the Senate's, one of the Senate's wonderful responsibilities. But we have a responsibility also to consider the question of our work, to question our work and our decisions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm not sure exactly how that addresses the amendment that's on the table, but I will address some of those things. Who checks the Senate? Who is to be the check on the Senate and whether they are right or wrong? Our government, from the federal level on down to the local levels, is full of checks and balances. When we run bills, there is a check on the legislation we run, and the governor can veto it. And there's even another check on that. There's the overriding of the veto. Multiple checks and balances in that regard. The Senate is the check on the governor when it comes to nominations. And if there is a check to be required on that, it resides in our own districts. It is the voters. It is our constituency that is the check on whether or not our decisions were correct or not on every level, be it on legislation we vote for or against, or whether it be on nominations from the governor. But the governor has no role in being the check on our ability to reject a nominee. It is a unique right given to us in our Constitution, but right now it was made toothless by the actions of the first floor, and this legislation would put the pieces back into their proper place on this chess table between the Senate and the governor. I would ask for a no vote on the amendment.
Seeing no further discussion, the question before us is the adoption of Amendment L007. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. The noes have it. L007 is lost. There is another amendment on the desk. Mr. Carpenter, please read Amendment L013.
Amendment L013 to Senate Bill 43.
Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, we've talked, I move Amendment L013. Thank
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's been a lot of interesting conversation around this bill, Senate Bill 43, and I think one thing, whether or not it's intentional, we're opening the box to is what I believe could be a process of a discriminatory practice in which you legally say someone's unfit for service. And I tend to think of things in the context of veterans and members who have served this great nation and what that means, and then to imply that they are legally unfit for service. And so Amendment L013 would say that you can't, regarding the appointment to the office based, that you can't discriminate on one's status as a disabled veteran. I think this is really important, and I'd ask for an aye vote on 013.
Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For reasons already stated, please vote no.
Seeing no, Senator Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I suppose we're going to do this all morning, and that's the right of senators in this chamber, but this moves from, and with all respect, but I am only speaking about the amendment itself. The amendment has gone from the ridiculous to the totally absurd. That someone in this chamber would reject a nomination of a person because they were a disabled veteran. I ask for a no vote.
Mr. Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think being respectful to those who have different opinions on this issue, you're finding how hard it is for them to articulate why. I don't find it absurd. I think this is extremely important. The fact that discrimination happens every single day and that you have organizations like the Disabled American Veterans Organizations are why we have organizations that protect members like that. And for this body to not be willing to even stand up and say, oh, we acknowledge that that could happen, so let's make sure we're proactive against protecting against that. Few times I think people can see me really, really passionate, but obviously when we're talking about veterans, I become very passionate. I spent 6 years in the Marine Corps. I was a mortuary affairs specialist. I saw and helped pick up remains of Marines who were killed in combat and bring them back to this country so they can have a proper burial. There are people who discriminate against veterans because they come back without their limbs. And I'm not implying that this body may do so, but to not protect against the fact that it could happen is irresponsible. This amendment would help ensure that these practices that should be safeguarded against. And, I call upon this body to reflect on generally our tone, because I think it's very easy from time to time, as I've said in the past, to say, support a veteran. It's Veterans Day. It's Veterans Week. We give them a discount. Veterans are here. Let's stand up and give them applause. Thank them for being here. But the reality is, those challenges they live with, they face every single day. And with so few serving in the armed forces, I think it's a unique, narrow perspective of those who actually understand what it's like to live in that realm. This amendment is straightforward. If you haven't had a chance to read the amendment, I would encourage you to do so. But the amendment helps protect that those who could be disqualified based on their disability status, that they would not be. And I think that's the essence of this entire conversation. I think someone would say, well, you're trying to put in this protected class or this, you're trying to make sure that we don't. Why would we not be responsible in doing that? Again, I'd ask for an aye vote on Amendment L01.
Senator Lundberg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. With all due respect to the previous speaker, for whom I certainly thank him for his service, and believe that we do need to show a great deal of respect for veterans, and particularly those who are disabled within their service. But this is not about that at all. This legislation is about the Senate asserting its authority, its constitutional authority, and not handing some of it over to the executive branch. This is a basic fundamental point that needs to be established, and I find it remarkable that we're spending so much time on what should be in my opinion, a very basic principle that we adhere to, but let us not erode the authority of the legislative branch. And by putting these exceptions, remarkable exceptions that have very little to do with any of the decision-making process, and it's beyond my understanding as to how the present amendment would ever be required for consideration. And if such an issue were to come up where someone's qualification would be questioned because of their disabled veteran status, I would presume that the majority of the Senate would rise up and say, not on my watch. It's, in my opinion, ludicrous to ever think that that would be an issue. But the point is, we should not box in the Senate's constitutional authority in any degree. This would set a precedent that would hobble the Senate and could be used by an executive within the state to play games, and that's not appropriate. Vote no on the amendment.
Senator Crowder.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've read the amendment, and as a 70% disabled American veteran, I ask for a no vote on this particular amendment. Thank you.
Senator Kagan.
Thank you, members. Just quickly, under current law, the governor can resubmit and resubmit and resubmit as many times as she wants. That's current law. And what this bill would do is say, no, you can't resubmit in any case in the same General Assembly, in any case, even once. So if we're talking about a change in the balance of power or a power grab, how about going from you can do this as often as you want under current law, but under our new bill, you can't even do it once under any circumstance. That is where the power grab is.
Senator Kagan, I assume you're talking to the amendment?
Yes. Okay. And so what this amendment says, is, okay, we'll accept that you can't resubmit again and again and again. You can't even resubmit more than once. But you can resubmit once if you believe, Governor, and so state, that there may have been discrimination on the basis of the person's status as a disabled veteran. Now, let me just make one point before anyone concludes that this is an absurd thought, that anyone could discriminate on the basis of being a disabled veteran. Let me point out to you, members, some disabled veterans have terrible disfigurement of their face. Terrible disfigurement. And they have to contend all the time with people who, though they are completely in possession of their mental faculties, have absolutely not lost any of their edge, but they have certainly lost their looks. They now are grossly disfigured. Can you just put yourselves in the shoes for a moment of a person who is grossly disfigured and knows that day in, day out, people recoil and are repelled by the way they look, and therefore don't want to be around them, never mind appoint them to positions of authority? That is a horrifying prospect for a disabled veteran who has served his or her country nobly and has suffered grievously for it in the form of facial disfigurement. And in case you think facial appearance can't affect an appointment decision, just look at the facts regarding former UN Ambassador John Bolton, who we know from press reports was repeatedly disqualified by the President of the United States from being Secretary of Defense because the President of the United States thought he didn't fit the part because of his mustache. And that is a fact that if a president can reject an appointment because he doesn't think the mustache looks right, how much more prone are disabled, disfigured veterans to perhaps allow our unconscious biases to creep in, thinking they are not the right look or fit for the job. And this bill says simply, not that you can be forced to take a third, fourth, fifth look, as now, but you should at least take a second look if the person is in such a condition.
Senator, Mr. Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the statement that was just made, I think of a good friend of mine, and I'll omit saying his name because he's well known. He's had over 300 surgeries, and a true Coloradan American veteran hero. But I think of the context of him being legally disqualified, and that bias that could be impugned by one body, and again, not to say that this body would do that, but I'm thinking futuristically. I mean, there could be others who felt compelled to be in that position. I just want to remind you that this amendment would be a protection for those veterans. On its face value, this is a protection for those veterans especially those who are disabled, I'd ask you to look favorably and vote aye on L013.
Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to address that very quickly, on its face value, and I believe another word that was used earlier about this amendment, and I think you could put it in context of the prior amendments as well, straightforward, I would contend that absolutely, that's true. It is straightforward, on its face value. It is a clear abdication of the Senate's authority to the first floor. And that is what this amendment and others do. It's not about the protected classes that are mentioned within, but it is about giving the governor just a little bit more of our authority and enshrining that in statute. We can talk about the governor's current ability to over and over and over and over again submit nominees. That has not ever been the case. The common practice within the state of Colorado between the governor and the Senate in any scenario where there is a rejection has been to the effects of what this bill would do. That has been the understanding within this state between the governor and the Senate upon rejections. There has never been a governor who thwarted the will of the Senate until last year.
Mr. Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to lay over Senate Bill 43 as amended to April 9th. Monday, April 9th.
The question before us is to lay over Senate Bill 43 until Monday, April 9th. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. Senate Bill 43 will be laid over. Mr. Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to lay over Senate Bill 166 at the sponsor's request to Tuesday, April 10th.
Question before us is to lay over Senate Bill 166 until Tuesday, April 10th. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. Senate Bill 166 will lay over.
You want to rise and report?
Chris. Mr. Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee rise and report.
Question before us is for the committee to rise and report. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. We will indeed rise and report.
Senate will come back to order. Senator Sonnenberg.
Thank you, Mr. President. Your committee has met. Well, I'm not sure they did anything, but Mr. Andrews, there we go again. Mr. Carpenter, would you please read whatever that report might be? Yeah, I know. Or Mr. Carpenter.
Mr. President, your committee of the whole begs leave reports had on consideration the following attached bills, being the second reading thereof, makes the following recommendations are on. Senate Bill 43 is amended, laid over until 4/9/18, retaining its place on the calendar. Senate Bill 166 laid over until 4/10/18, retaining its place on the calendar.
Senator Sonnenberg.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of that phenomenal report.
The motion before the body is the adoption of the report to the committee of the whole. Are there any no votes? With 34 ayes, there are noes, there are absent, one excused. The committee of the whole report is adopted. Senate Bill 43 is amended, laid over till 4/9/18, retaining its place on the calendar. Senate Bill 166 laid over until 4/10/18, retaining its place on the calendar. Consideration of House amendments to Senate bills. Mr. Carpenter, would you please read the title of the Senate Bill 55?
Senate Bill 55 by Senator Neville and Representatives Van Winkle and Hooten concerning the crimes against children surcharge in cases involving trafficking of children.
Senator Neville.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that we concur with the House amendments.
Could you give a brief explanation of House amendments?
It was a weighty one, Mr. President. On page 2, line 22, there was a change. Actually, I'm sorry, page 3, line 7, and a number of other areas. They changed the words instead of defendant or defendants, they substituted offender or offenders.
Is there any further discussion? Motion for the body is for the Senate to concur with House amendments to Senate Bill 55. Are there any no votes on concurrence? With 34 ayes, 0 noes, 0 absent, 1 excused, that motion is adopted and the Senate concurs with House amendments to Senate Bill 55. Senator Neville.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the readoption of Senate Bill 55.
Motion for the body is the readoption of Senate Bill 55. Are there any no votes? With 34 ayes, 0 noes, 0 absent, 1 excused, Senate Bill 55 is readopted. Co-sponsors. If you are already on there, you're good. And that is most of you. Again, you're good. Mr. Carpenter, would you please read the title of Senate Bill 169?
Senate Bill 169 by Senator Gardner and Representative Carver concerning offenses against witnesses in non-criminal proceedings.
Senator Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I reluctantly move that the Senate concur with House amendments to Senate Bill 169.
Any explanation for your actions, sir?
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, I'm moving that we concur with House amendments to Senate Bill 169 because I'm tired. And it's late in the session. And, you know, this bill is a really important bill concerning offenses against witnesses in non-criminal proceedings, because there was a court case across the street that said that we don't think that the statute you have applies to non-criminal proceedings. So the solution to this was that I and my House co-prime sponsor, Representative Carver, changed the language to say a witness in any criminal, civil, or administrative proceeding to resolve all doubt that intimidating a witness in any kind of legal proceeding in Colorado was a crime. And House Judiciary, I don't know whether they have, well, I think they have too many lawyers on that committee. You may want to take note of my statement. There may be too many lawyers on the committee because they got in a discussion about whether administrative needed to be there, whether that included other proceedings. And so they struck administrative, and now it reads criminal or civil, and that's fine, but an administrative proceeding is not a criminal proceeding, so it must be a civil proceeding. And you see where this goes. I would just as soon move on and get this bill done, and House Judiciary is not a place that you ever want your bill to go. If you think Senate Judiciary is bad, I ask for concurrence, and I vote on my motion.
The motion is that the Senate Majority Leader Holbert.
Thank you, Mr. President. I asked for a senatorial 5. It has been brought to my attention that we may not have the updated bill in our folders, and again, just so we can make sure we know what we're doing here, I've asked the Secretary to check on that. May we have a senatorial 5?
We in a senatorial 5. Senate will come back to order. Majority Leader Holbert.
Thank you, Mr. President. Wait. I'll ask for another senatorial 5. Looks like things are changing again.
Will be in another senatorial 5. Senate will come back to order. Where are we at? Senator Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. President. So, members, now that everyone has a copy, if you'll look at the introduced version of this bill and compare it to the revised version of the bill on page 2, you'll see that the words criminal, civil, or administrative proceeding have been changed to criminal or civil proceeding in each place that they appear. This is a momentous change made by the House Judiciary Committee, one which will create further discussion the next time this matter comes before the Colorado Court of Appeals of the Colorado Supreme Court, and will cause further General Assemblies to make further legislation to further correct the misunderstandings of our legislation. But nevertheless, it is day 87, and I just don't have the energy to do anything other than ask for an aye vote on concurrence.
Senator Moreno.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, my concern for my colleague from El Paso County's mental and physical well-being notwithstanding, I will be a no vote on concurrence. I do believe victims deserve to be protected from intimidation in administrative proceedings as well.
Senator Gardner.
Thank you. Well, and I appreciate the senator from Adams County and his concern. The thing is, I learned in law school that there's civil proceedings and there's criminal proceedings, and if something's not a criminal proceeding, then it's a civil proceeding, and therefore, even if it was an administrative proceeding, it would be a civil proceeding. But then, I don't know, the senator from Cherry Hills Village may disagree with me about that. I guess it would be worth taking a serious moment to say that it is the understanding of this legislator that the words civil or criminal encompass any sort of legal proceeding, whether it's before an administrative law judge or an administrative panel in which a member or which a witness would be under oath, and I ask for an aye vote.
Is there any further discussion on concurrence? Senator Kagan.
I would just reiterate from, as ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, that it is my understanding also that this would apply to administrative proceedings, even though they are not spelled out, because they are in the subset of civil proceedings. So let the legislative record show that our understanding of this does include administrative proceedings. And I urge an aye vote on concurrence.
Let the record show that Senators Gardner and Kagan agreed on something. The motion before us is concurrence on House amendments to Senate Bill 169. Are there any no votes on concurrence? Senator Moreno, Senator Donovan, Senator Baumgardner, Senator Guzman, Senator Kerr. With 29 ayes, 5 noes, 0 absent, 1 excused, the Senate concurs with House amendments to Senate Bill 169. Senator Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the repassage of Senate Bill 169.
The motion before the body is the readoption of Senate Bill 169. Are there any no votes? With 34 ayes, 0 noes, 0 absent, 1 excused, Senate Bill 169 is readopted. Co-sponsors. Senator John, you're already on. If you co-sponsored it the first go-around. Senator Fields. Announcements. Majority Leader Holbert.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, 1 week from today is an important deadline. If you wish to request an interim committee, if you have legislation that involves an interim committee, next Friday, lucky 13, is the deadline to submit this application. If you wonder where you would find this application and the attached memo, look in your email inbox for an email from the Office of Legislative Counsel. If you cannot find that email, the Office of Legislative Counsel is, of course, located in the basement of this building in the north end. And if you can't find the north end and you accidentally end up in the south end, you could go into the Office of Legislative Legal Services, and they have this memo and this form too. If by chance you can't find the basement of the Capitol, you could come up here to the desk, and I have already received yet today a copy of this memo that has this form attached to it, just from Senate staff right here in this here chamber. So, again, if you want to request an interim committee, your deadline to do that in writing on this form is next Friday, April 13th. I also would note, for those who represent multi-county districts, I believe, my understanding is that both major parties will hold multi-county district assemblies next Friday, April 13th. So if you are planning to be at one of those, please let me know so I have some idea whether we can establish a quorum next Friday, the 13th. And then if you're not going to be here on that Friday the 13th, remember then your deadline for this memo would then be Thursday the 12th, I would assume, unless you would have somebody deliver that to you. So once you have the form from either of the multiple places, your email inbox, Legislative Counsel, Legislative Legal Services, or the desk right here, where would you turn this in? Well, according to this memo, you would turn it into Legislative Counsel, so someone would need to take that to Legislative Counsel, which is in the basement on the north end of the building. Thank you.
Senator Tate.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just announcing that schedule change for Senate Bill 219 and Senate Business. We will be rescheduling that bill for Monday, April 16th as the second bill on the calendar. So Senate Bill 219 will be on April 16th. Thank you.
Senator Todd.
Thank you, Mr. President. And just as a reminder, I know that we've all heard this earlier this week, that April is Child Abuse Prevention Month. And so when we look at that and think about that and we talk about it on one day, it is for the rest of this month for us to raise our awareness. And as a result of that, I'm going to sneak in a little comment in the fact that I am celebrating today of being a grandmother for 11 years. So happy birthday, Hannah. And to her parents who are going to be having a first sleepover with 11-year-old little girls, I think it's even more important that I talk with them about Child Abuse Prevention Month. So thank you very much, and have a good weekend.
Senator Lambert.
Hearing about the sleepover, I wonder if Senator Todd ought to be excused for the Monday session.
Leaving that one alone, Senator Moreno.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I'm wearing red today because it is HIV Advocacy Day at the Capitol. They are located throughout the Capitol and may be chatting with you today about the importance of HIV prevention programs. If you have some time, please visit them in Senate Committee Room 357 to learn about HIV prevention. Thank you.
Any further announcements? Majority Leader Holbert.
Thank you, Mr. President. I believe some of our colleagues who live west of the Continental Divide are already headed to their cars, so I would just wonder if anyone wants to issue a call of the Senate and just... Anybody? Any takers? I believe we have at least one member who might still be headed to Coors Field. Hopefully opening day will, two members maybe headed that way, and hopefully the weather will hold off enough that the Rockies will get to play their first game at home. Members, I wish you a safe travel home and a relaxing weekend. We do not have bills to read over later today, so we are out of here Mr. President, I move the Senate adjourn until 10 a.m. Monday, April 9th, 2018.
Motion is for the Senate to adjourn till 10 a.m. Monday, April 9th. All those in favor say aye. All opposed, no. The ayes have it. The Senate will stand in adjournment.